welcome to the Musical Orbits webinar with Celia Craig, the Principal Oboe of the Adelaide Symphony Orchestra, and she's going to talk to us today about auditions, audition preparation and success. Excellent. Thanks, Celia. Good morning to you, or evening, in fact, because you're in Australia.
It is, yes. Hello.
We've got some questions already come in. It's quite a stressful time an audition, isn't it? And Sibylla asks, what's the main difference between auditions in Australia and Britain? Now, you've had jobs in Britain and Australia, so you're in a fairly unique position to be able to compare and contrast this.
Yes, there is quite a difference, and I think I've learned quite a lot from sitting on audition panels and doing auditions in Australia, actually, because it's closer to the American sort of system. There's a lot of orchestras in Australia, and everybody does it slightly differently, but basically behind the screens, 3 rounds of auditions, everybody gets auditioned, and it's a question of being able to play your excerpts, you know, as well as possible, hopefully perfectly.
Yeah, how much does it rely on perfection? You know, the great thing about the system in Britain, I think, is that, you know, you can be human, you can make mistakes, they like you taking the risks, and then you come and do a trial and show how you actually do the job.
Yes.
Do you need to be damn near perfect?
More, I think that is probably, but I mean, people who do perfect auditions, then if they get through with all the panelists in Australia, they then go on to a 6-month trial. So basically, they're doing the job for 6 months. Whereas in the British system, you do have the chance to be human. That's a very good way of putting it. So that was the system I'd been brought up with, where the crucial thing in Britain is how you play in the orchestra. I mean, after all, that is the end result. That's what you have to do. But yes, in Australia, it's a little bit more who's done the sort of the perfect audition, I suppose. But you know, preparing for a perfect audition is a good thing for everybody. So, and obviously achieving it would be good.
Well, you've managed to achieve it several times. Congratulations. Tell us, how do you prepare for an audition? What's the first thing you do when you think, right, I'm going to do it? You send in your letter. What do you do?
You get your metronome out. It's, you know, it's one thing that I've really learned more being in Australia, I think, is that British players are looking for musicianship as well as perfection. And I think that in order to put the musicianship in, sometimes you can be a little bit on the self-indulgent side, trying to show it, trying to exaggerate things to show musicianship. Whereas, I mean, really, what everybody wants is somebody who can play perfectly in time and perfectly in tune. And practicing those 2 things are the best place to start. So really, I mean, I know that the best audition preparation for me is to start with scales anyway, because it's the foundation of everything.
Yeah. When you went from Britain to Australia, obviously there's a big difference, I think, isn't there, in temperature, for sure, and humidity. Is there a thing that we have Nancy saying, did you have difficulty adjusting to temperature and humidity in Australia, having come from Britain? Particularly
Well,
when they did the actual audition, because you wouldn't have had that much time to adjust.
Well, when I first came to Australia, I was freelancing and I wasn't looking for any auditions because I knew I wanted to live near the family, because we had elderly relatives not very well without. And so I was just freelancing and not really doing that many auditions. But for the work, going to different places, I mean, my first work was in Tasmania, and the humidity is quite serious there. It's a bit like playing in Wales. So it does take a while for the reeds to adjust, but Australia is such an enormous country. It's like saying, how do you adjust to the humidity in Russia? Well, I mean, it's about that sort of size. So, I mean, where I am now, there's no humidity, nothing. The reeds are like twigs. But if you work in Brisbane, it's hot and humid, and if you work in Tasmania or Melbourne, it's cold and damp, really, quite a lot of the time.
So how
so it does vary.
Sorry. So when you go into an audition, you may have flown in, especially for that day, quite possibly.
Yes.
What would your advice be to an oboist or a cor anglais player who came in and had to gauge it when they got there and play their best and play perfectly? What little handy tips have you got?
Well, one little handy tip, which was given to me as soon as I got to Australia, which is marvellous, is to keep the top joint of your oboe right under your arm. because it's going to stay with your body temperature, and your air is going to be that same temperature. And what I find is not just the humidity, but the worst thing about auditions is air conditioning. And you're standing in air conditioning for maybe half an hour or an hour before you actually play. And that I've noticed with my students now as well. You see, you often hang around waiting to play, and then you just pick up your oboe cold, and it's just a disaster if it gets cold. So you will get water in the instrument, and then horrible bubbling sort of sound. So keep it as warm as possible, and during the playing journey, it's really great to have a humidifier in it. In fact, a violin dampit works brilliantly for us because it can fit inside the top joint. It just fits nice little long thing. It's lovely. Although my husband's quite keen on people making homemade ones. Actually, you can make a homemade humidifier, but the idea is to keep the humidity more constant in the case than it is outside. I'm sure string players are very familiar with that, but oboists less so.
Right. So yes, your husband used to work at Haworth of London, didn't he? So he's gone out with you to Australia. Great. What about these homemade humidifiers then? What does he make them out of?
Actually, washing up sponge.
Really?
He's actually Australian, so he was going home again. He was a student working, a overseas student working at Howard's, and then he ended up staying there 24 years or something. And right from the start, he told me, I think one of his teachers had told him that a small square of, that washing up cloth that that's quite spongy, but not really big, thick one, like a absorbent cloth. A little square of that, and then wrapped around with silver foil, so that there's only a little tiny bit of the cloth left. That just to stop water soaking into the case, because you don't want the instrument itself to get wet. And it's only going to be a tiny bit damp, but putting that inside the case is quite good. And actually, I found other people around here who are very keen on orange peel as well. They say that the orange essential oils kind of leak out beautifully smelling humidity in the case, but that needs to be changed every time the peel gets dry, so that's quite cool. I mean, it actually works quite well, but I mean, it's just, you don't want to shock your instrument too much, do you? Or your reeds.
And a handy snack as well, which would be nice to have a little bit of orange. Yeah. Daniel asks, what made you swap to the oboe? Now, you were principal cor anglais of the BBC Symphony Orchestra, amongst other things, for quite a while, and you're now principal oboe of Adelaide. So what happened there? What was the journey there?
Oh, well, I mean, necessity, really. I mean, every cor anglais player is somebody who started on the oboe. Everybody learns oboe first. So we're all going back to the oboe, really. But I mean, I became a specialist on cor anglais in England. I absolutely loved it. It's just a wonderful chair to have. You're involved with violas and trumpets and bassoons and trombones, and it's a really mellow kind of situation. But I always played oboe as well, and I always wanted to keep my principal playing. So it had done previous jobs, and I'd done freelance principal work in the City of Birmingham or Royal Scottish National Orchestra, City of Birmingham Symphony. It's lovely to get out there and be a principal player, because if you don't keep doing it, then it's hard. So I'd made an attempt to already keep that up. But, you can't just roll up in Sydney and say, I'm a freelancer, I only play the cor. I mean, it's not going to work. There's not a call for just cor anglais. So I went around saying to people, I play oboe and cor anglais, and here I am. And I got lots and lots of commercial work and lots of different orchestral work, and operas and ballets. And so it wasn't possible to just play cor. It's nice to get back on the oboe, really.
In fact, Daniel asked about opera. He asked if you've played opera much, and he says, do you find it easier or harder repertoire for the oboe than the cor anglais? How does it compare? Fairly pearly stuff on cor anglais, I've heard many.
Yes, the oboes are always playing more often, so there's a bit less of counting. I mean, when you're a cor anglais player, you have to be really good at counting rests, because if you get it wrong, you'll probably miss an enormous solo. So somebody says it's 3 hours of boredom and 3 minutes of huge pain playing the cor anglais. So you have to keep counting, whereas the oboe plays all the time. And opera, and particularly ballet, I had no idea was quite so tiring. When I first got to Sydney, it was wonderful to get to hear the full score, play all the music. And sometimes I'd play the same opera on cor and then a bit on oboe as well, because in Sydney they've had a noise rostering system for a long time. It meant that the whole orchestra couldn't play the entire opera and ballet. So there's quite a lot freelance work because of the very, very painful noise levels of the pit in Sydney. So that was nice to get that sort of work. And playing on oboe, I just think you get more involved in the whole thing. The core, I wouldn't say it can be boring. It's not boring because you get all the best tunes and everything, but you interact much more with the flutes and the violins, of course, on the oboe part. Whereas the cor anglais is in a different sort of a sound world. So that's been really interesting for me, going back after being a cor anglais player for many years, going back to the same pieces that I've played on cor and then playing them again on oboe. I mean, for a start, they changed.
I have to ask you a question as a non-wind player. Oboists, of course, always scraping their reeds. We see you all the time. It's obviously a very stressful thing to do. Cor anglais players seem much more laid back. They don't seem so wound up about the reed thing. Is this just the cor anglais players I've met? Or is it different?
Yes, well, you could be right there. I'm sure that now I'm in my oboe chair, I'm fussier, not fussier, that's wrong, but I find it more difficult to get the perfect reed. I mean, yes, cor anglais players, to be fair, they'll probably shoot me down in flames with this, but cor anglais players do have slightly more time off to make their reeds. They've got a piece off here and there in the program, and they do their scraping slightly more in private, whereas the oboists are just there the whole time. So I think it's just more publicly visible.
Yes, good. Thank you for answering that for me. That's lovely. Now then, Sibylla asks, are there standard pieces set for cor auditions? And are they the same all over the world?
Oh no, that's a very interesting one actually. Set pieces for cor auditions can be a bit of a hot potato really, because there's not the obvious pieces like we have with the oboe. I mean, with the oboe, Strauss, maybe a Schumann, that sort of thing. But with the cor, there's the Donizetti concerto, which lots of people do set, but I'm not that keen on it because I think it's too high. I'm not quite sure if this is correct, but the historic story that I was told was that the Donizetti was written for a cor anglais in G and not in F, so it's one tone bit too high when we play it. So I don't think it suits the instrument particularly well. So for cor anglais auditions, I'd always selected my own piece, and there's some boxers. The boxer pieces are really good. They're good show pieces. Anything that was written for the Paris Conservatoire shows off any wind player really, really well, because that had always been the sort of the peak of wind playing for a long time. So there's lots of good sort of show-offy pieces. Eugene Botzer had written a few. There's a Fantasy Pastoral is the cor anglais one, the oboe one. I always get mixed up with the different Botzer pieces, but basically anything by Botzer would be great. Ravel, Pièce en forme de habanera I play, but then I am transposing it. And yeah, it can be a little bit tricky. Suonocinella works quite well as well, because I mean, obviously that's a great excerpt. It's just that it doesn't go so well on the piano.
That's another question, actually. So for orchestral excerpts, what's the standard ones? I mean, the ones that stick in my mind are Shostakovich 8, of course, is a...
that is the world's greatest cor anglais excerpt. It's absolutely brilliant. But funnily enough, when I got to Australia, I hadn't found many people had already learnt that or even knew it. I mean, cor anglais players, it just depends on your orchestra and what the repertoire comes up. And if you've been in a job and they haven't asked for Shostakovich 8, but you'd always be playing William Tell, you'd always be playing Roman Carnival Overture, you'd always be playing the Ravel Piano Concerto and the Suonocinella. They're the kind of the 4 standard ones on the cor. And the oboists are going to have the Rossini, the Silken Ladder, Strauss Don Juan, Beethoven oboe concerto, Brahms violin concerto. I mean, Beethoven violin concerto. It feels like an oboe concerto. Brahms violin concerto. And the important thing with all those excerpts is to show the talent that you know the music, not just you can play your instrument, but you know that music. So just that's the other thing. Is the first thing I think of when auditions come up is I'm trying to get the students to go and listen to their excerpts.
Yeah.
Reading them is one thing, but you've got to know them, haven't you? That's the same on every instrument.
And also many different recordings, because of course they're played so wildly differently depending on who you hear. So it's good to choose your own way, isn't it? Be able to justify it.
Well, quite often in auditions in Australia, so certainly with the Australian Youth Orchestra, I've found that sometimes they'll be putting in the metronome marks to say the speed that they want it. Well, in that case, you better just go for that one, even if you've heard a recording that's different.
Yeah.
As long as you can play at that speed, and if you can't, then you better just get practicing, I suppose.
We got a question here from Sibylla again. It says, what's the most scary solo in the orchestral repertoire? So I mean, two there, oboe and cor. What?
Yes. Well, it's funny you mentioned Shostakovich 8, because that has to be the most scary cor anglais solo. I mean, you know, you're supposed to represent a cockroach after a nuclear bomb or something, and that's how it feels as well. You just all on your own, and it's supposed to be scary, and it is scary. But then I had to learn, you know, maybe the hard way, but lots of cor anglais solos can be quite low and creepy and scary, like that piece. I mean, they should be. You're acting scared, so you don't have to be scared. I mean, an actor wouldn't necessarily have to be scared to look it. So try and think of yourself as an actor. That'd be great. And the oboe ones, it sort of depends on who you are and what suits you best. Don Juan Strauss is a really, really nasty excerpt always, but I mean, basically anything can be, depends what you've got to be in your bonnet about. But don't trying not to let them be scary, trying to enjoy the music. You know, if it's all about the music, really.
Yeah. So what is going through your head just before one of those big solos comes up? Say you've played many times, I'm sure, at the BBC proms. The TV cameras are on you. As it comes, the camera zooms in. How do you keep your calm and act rather than be scared, like you say?
Well, when I first got into the profession, I was, you know, having to play those things for real, and they are pretty scary, and you have to find ways to deal with it for certain. And at one point I phoned up Christine, my teacher, and said, what am I going to do with this solo? You know, you get a bit of advice from the professionals, and her idea was, don't forget to breathe. And I've used that as a bit, I mean, it's got to be a mantra really, because we're all about the breath and the vocal line really for us. So the best thing I can do is to breathe in tempo, breathe with the music, not aside it. If you can slightly, if it's a very fast piece, then take several beats to breathe, and if it's a very slow piece, take a very slow in breath. It really helps to calm you down. They don't say, you know, like if you're in yoga or something, they make you breathe calmly and all this. It really works. So the breath is absolutely the key. And maybe also just one other thing that might help is that, I mean, we're talking now about playing the solos in the repertoire rather than in the audition, which is a slightly different. I mean, if you can summon up some of that nervous feeling, if it's scary solo, that's quite good, because it makes it seem as if you know the music well. But yes, it's a completely different kettle of fish with a camera, TV camera on you. Sometimes I found that if I try and locate tension in one particular part of the body in order to let the rest of it be free, because you're going to have to, you're human, you're going to be tense somewhere. In my case, sometimes it's just, I allow the thighs to be tense so that everywhere else can be relaxed, because the last thing you want to do is to get all nervous up in the shoulders. Yeah, because that won't help.
That's a good idea. I'd never thought of doing that. Yeah, instead of trying to get rid of the tension, just send it somewhere else. Good advice.
Yes, just say, right, you can go there. That's fine. Now the rest of me will be good.
Brilliant. So just time for one last question. Nancy's asking, how different was it playing? Is it playing in Adelaide to the BBC in London? How orchestras? How have they been different?
That's interesting. I mean, because the BBC, when you're in an English orchestra, you do have a bit of a camaraderie about British orchestral players, which is quite unique. There's just the way everybody gets everybody else's jokes, and everybody's been trained in a similar sort of way, even if you've come from different teachers. There's a bit of a sort of collective mindset that is slightly different in Australia, I found, both in Sydney, New Zealand and Adelaide as well, maybe Melbourne too when I was there, is that they're a more diverse collection of people. There's some people who've come from America, and there's some people who are from Australia, and there's some people who are from England. And I have to say that all of those orchestras, especially with Adelaide, incredibly refreshingly friendly and willing to work, not cynical, which is really marvellous. I mean, everybody's really sort of just wanted to get on with the job and do a good job, and waiting to be told what to do. So without wishing to go too far with this theory, but I do think that British orchestral players are very self-reliant. But quite often the BBC Symphony would be able to play a piece even without the conductor. They just play it. Yeah. So that has its ups and its downs as well, but they play it beautifully. I mean, so musically it's wonderful, but it's a slightly different mindset. And I mean, the Australian mindset that we've got here in Adelaide is just really refreshing and open and super friendly. And I'll never forget first getting to Sydney and my first rehearsal in the Opera House, but it was with a commercial orchestra. And one of the horn players said to the conductor, would you like that legato, mate? No. Took me ages to work out what he'd said, and then I realised it was legato. But just the way the questions are asked, it would be the same if you'd moved to any country, if you'd moved to America or whatever. It's a bit, it's lovely actually to hear the different languages and the questions that get asked.
Yeah. And so if somebody from Australia did an audition for an orchestra in Britain maybe, and they got a trial, so they would then be coming and working with them before they, hopefully got the job. What social advice would you give them then for fitting in, keeping their head?
Well, I must say I was schooled quite heavily by various teachers that I had about orchestral etiquette in Britain, and that seems to be quite important. And for example, not turning round, just to have a look and see who's behind you. I mean, that sounds obvious, but not looking over somebody else's music as well. Definitely not peering over somebody else's music, because that can really annoy a few people. And yes, just it's a very professional feeling of keeping yourself to yourself, and you play your part, but while listening to what everything else is going on, but not being seen to interfere in any way. Whereas I think that people in Australia are more open to a little bit more interaction between people. So I was very careful in London not to look over somebody's music or start pointing at somebody's music or something like that. And also other social things is that it's very, very important in Britain to get the tea if you're the junior person. If you're the new one in the section, you have to get the teas in. If you don't offer, that's a bit of a faux pas.
This is a recurring theme in our webinar. So many people have said this. So guys, really important to get the tea. Thank you so much, Celia, for talking to us today. I believe you are actually coming over to Britain at Christmas.
Yes, at Christmas I can't wait. It'll be lovely. I want to have Christmas with the family and a bit of cold again, and hopefully I'll be doing some work here and there.
Lovely. So if you would like a lesson online with Celia, or on location in Adelaide, or when she comes over, perhaps we can persuade her to give you a lesson when she comes to London, do let us know. Contact us at www.musicalorbit.com. Thanks so much, Celia.
Our little friends are flying through the galaxy.